Hey guys, tonight we step into the heart of Lisbon on a bright November morning in the year 1755, a day that would change Europe forever. The air is crisp, the sunlight glimmers on the Tagus River, and the city is alive with the hum of devotion. It's All Saints' Day, one of the holiest mornings in the Catholic calendar. Bells ring across the hills, echoing from the whitewashed domes and tiled roofs. You walk through narrow streets lined with bakeries and candle shops, past carriages rumbling over cobblestones slick with dew. All around, people are dressed in their Sunday best, streaming toward churches heavy with incense and prayer. Lisbon is one of the richest cities in Europe. Gold from Brazil flows through its ports, spices from India perfume its markets, and silk from China shimmers in its shops. It is a city that believes itself blessed, the western jewel of Christendom. You can feel the confidence in the air, the sense that Lisbon, so pious and prosperous, is favored by both God and the world. No one imagines that in less than an hour, that same faith will be tested in ways that will shake not only the ground beneath their feet, but the very foundations of European thought.
Inside the grand church of São Vicente de Fora, candles flicker before marble altars, choirs begin to sing. In the Baixa, Lisbon's bustling commercial district, merchants open their shutters and greet the rising sun. The scent of fresh bread mingles with that of salt and tar drifting from the docks. Life feels orderly, blessed, predictable. But if you look closely, if you listen, you might sense something slightly off. A strange stillness in the air, a hush before a storm no one can imagine.
At 9:40 a.m. the first tremor hits. It comes like a deep, subterranean growl, the kind that seems to rise from the center of the earth. You freeze. The ground quivers beneath your boots, the glass of shop windows rattles, and for a heartbeat, no one moves. Then comes the real shock, a thunderous heave that throws you off balance. The street ripples like the surface of a pond struck by a stone. You hear the first screams as buildings begin to sway, walls splitting with a deafening crack. The churches, packed with worshippers, become death traps. Chandeliers crash down from ceilings, columns split like trees, struck by lightning, and frescoed domes collapse in clouds of dust and ash. The Cathedral of Lisbon, centuries old, shudders as its roof gives way. The smell of incense is suddenly replaced by that of lime, smoke, and burning wax. In moments, entire congregations are buried alive beneath the marble they came to worship under. You stumble into the open, gasping for air. The city around you unrecognizable. The elegant royal palace, perched on the waterfront, collapses into the Tagus. Streets twist and buckle. The roar of the earth drowns out human voices. Horses scream, church bells clang wildly, and the sky fills with dust so thick it turns morning into twilight. You can barely stand upright as the cobblestones beneath your feet shift like the deck of a ship in a storm. The shaking lasts 6 full minutes, longer than you think possible for the world to come apart. When it finally stops, the silence feels alien, heavy, wrong. You can hear the crackle of small fires starting all around you. The ground is littered with debris, broken icons, shattered glass, and human cries. From the direction of the waterfront, someone shouts that the river is behaving strangely. You push through the panicked crowd toward the Praça do Comércio, the grand square facing the Tagus, where moments ago ships floated peacefully in the harbor. The water is retreating, pulling back, leaving boats stranded in the mud. People stare, pointing, murmuring prayer. Some, thinking the danger is over, rush down to the riverbed to collect flopping fish and treasures exposed by the receding tide. Children laugh. A few priests raise crucifixes to the sky in gratitude. Then comes the sound, low at first, then building, a roar like the approach of an oncoming train. Someone shouts, "The sea is coming back." You turn, and over the horizon, you see it, a wall of water, 30 to 40 feet high, glittering in the sunlight, racing toward the city. There is no time to run. The wave crashes into the harbor, picks up ships like toys, and hurls them into the streets. Stone quays disintegrate. The royal warehouses vanish beneath the surge. People scream as they are swept through alleys and into walls. Wooden houses collapse, carried away by the torrent. Within minutes, Lisbon's lower city is a lake of floating debris, timbers, carriages, bodies, furniture, church pews, and broken statues of saints. Those who fled inland think they are safe, but they are wrong. Fires, sparked by fallen candles and overturned braziers, begin to spread through the upper districts. The wind picks up, fanning the flames into infernos that race through the ruins. The city that was crushed by the earth and drowned by the sea is now burning. By midday, Lisbon is an apocalyptic landscape. Smoke billows upward, blotting out the sun. The air is so hot it sears your lungs. Survivors huddle on the hills outside the city, watching helplessly as the capital of an empire becomes a furnace. Some pray, some curse, some simply sit in stunned silence. The earthquake that struck Lisbon that morning was one of the most powerful in recorded history. Modern estimates put it between magnitude 8.5 and 9.2. Its shockwaves raced across Europe and Africa, shaking churches in Morocco and chandeliers in Paris. But nowhere was the devastation greater than here, in this glittering city on the Atlantic edge of Europe. And as the fires roar and the sea withdraws once more, you realize the ground beneath your feet is not the only thing that has shifted. Something deeper, something in the human spirit has cracked as well. Faith, once unshakable, now trembles. Europe itself has begun to change. The first tremor was terrifying enough, but what followed turned terror into nightmare. You stand in the choking dust, heart hammering, when the ground begins to move again. A deeper, rolling vibration shudders through the ruins. The aftershock comes harder, stronger, as if the city itself is being wrung like wet cloth. Masonry crashes down around you, whole streets buckle and fold. It's not just shaking, it's heaving. The ground rises and falls like a living thing. You see people flung to their knees, clutching rosaries, screaming prayers that vanish beneath the roar. The bells of shattered churches clang wildly, each swing marking another collapse. A man beside you falls to the ground, crossing himself again and again, his eyes fixed on the sky. You follow his gaze, and realize that the air is full of swirling ash, the light gone strange and dim, the sun reduced to a dull orange glow behind the smoke. Lisbon's grandeur is disintegrating. The proud stone palaces of the Baixa crumble into heaps. The lavish church of São Domingos, where morning mass had been filled with the faithful, now lies split open like a cracked shell. At Carmel Convent, the Gothic arches sway for an instant before folding inward, crushing hundreds beneath falling stone. In the Royal Opera House, newly opened and emanated by Europe's elite, chandeliers crash down onto rows of empty red velvet seats. The noise is unbearable, a chorus of screams, grinding stone, splintering timber, and the rumble of collapsing walls. For 6 minutes, Lisbon is an orchestra of destruction. And when silence finally comes again, it is almost worse. You can hear your own breathing. You can hear the faint sobbing of survivors calling for lost children, the clinking of crucifixes dropped into the rubble. Then, slowly, the city begins to burn. At first its small candles toppled in churches, kitchen fires overturned, lanterns shattered in the panic. But the city's buildings, packed tightly together with wooden beams and shingled roofs, catch quickly. The wind rises from the river, feeding the flames. Within minutes, plumes of smoke twist upward from every quarter. The fire spreads like thought, jumping from street to street, chasing survivors into the open squares. Those squares, wide and sunlit hours earlier, are now scenes of chaos. Thousands gather, bruised and bleeding, clutching children or dragging bundles of salvaged possessions. Some stand silent, too stunned to move. Others pray loudly, their voices rising in desperate chorus. Priests shout litanies. Soldiers try to maintain order, but fear has stripped Lisbon of reason. Somewhere nearby, a noblewoman kneels on the stones, her gown torn and smeared with ash, whispering over and over, "God's wrath, God's wrath." You push toward the waterfront, where rumors say the ships are still afloat. But when you reach the Praça do Comércio, the great square by the Tagus River, the sight freezes you in place. The river is gone. The entire harbour lies dry, its bed cracked and glistening with mud. Galleons tilt on their sides like stranded beasts, masts groaning. The smell of salt and seaweed fills the air. People rush forward to stare, astonished, murmuring that the world is ending. And then you hear it, a low rumble from the horizon, the kind of sound that builds in your chest before it reaches your ears. A few seconds later, the water returns, and it does not creep, it charges. A wall of seawater, 30 or 40 feet high, bursts into the harbour. It smashes through the quays, tossing ships like driftwood. Entire crowds vanish beneath it in an instant. The surge sweeps through the Baixa, swallowing everything in its path. Furniture, carriages, bodies, whole houses, the royal palace, already cracked by the quake, disappears beneath the wave. People clinging to floating wreckage are swept back out toward the sea when the water recedes, their screams fading into the distance. And still, it is not over. The earth continues to tremble. Buildings that survived the first shocks collapse under the aftershocks. Fissures open in the streets, swallowing anyone too slow to move. The air smells of sulfur and smoke. Survivors flee uphill toward the Alfamar and the Saint-Roch district. Dragging wounded relatives, tripping over rubble from the higher ground, they turn to look back and watch their city burning. The tsunami's retreat leaves behind a chaos of wreckage, overturned boats, shattered carts, the bodies of men, women and children tangled with livestock and timbers. Fires leap from floating debris to the ruins of houses, spreading faster than anyone can fight them. By late morning, the entire lower city is a furnace. Flames roar through the narrow lanes, consuming wooden balconies and tiled roofs. The heat is so fierce it melts church bells, so intense it drives people to the river's edge again and again, only to find that the water has turned deadly. Even stone seems to burn. The scent of cinnamon and spice from shattered warehouses mixes grotesquely with that of burning flesh. The survivors stumble upward, past cracked stairways and broken walls. Every open space, every field, garden and hill is filled with refugees. The royal family flees to the countryside, setting up tents on a hillside to escape the inferno. King José I is too traumatized to return to the city. He will never again sleep inside stone walls. By nightfall, the flames paint the sky blood red. The sound of collapsing walls continues deep into the night. From miles away, sailors at sea can see Lisbon's glow, a vast, trembling horizon of fire. In the darkness, people huddle together, hungry, cold, and terrified. Some pray aloud, others are silent, hollow-eyed. Many believe the end of the world has come, that judgment day is upon them. They whisper confessions, clutching at priests, begging for absolution. But some begin to ask a different question. If this is not the end of the world, then why would God allow such horror to fall upon the faithful on his holy day? Lisbon, once the pride of Christendom, lies in ruins. Its gold, its cathedrals, its royal palaces, all gone in a single morning. The survivors sit beneath a sky veiled in smoke, watching the embers rise like dying stars. The city will burn for nearly a week, and when the fires finally die, 85% of it will be gone. And yet, amid the ruin, the story of Lisbon will not end in despair. In the ashes, a new vision will rise, a vision that will rebuild, not just a city but an idea of modern Europe itself. When the first tremors finally subsided, and the smoke began to thin, Lisbon did not look like a city anymore. It looked like the carcass of one. Streets once alive with carriages and laughter had become rivers of ash. The marble facades of palaces stood half-toppled, like broken teeth, their interiors gutted by fire. The air was still thick with the scent of burnt cedar, incense and death. Somewhere in the distance, church bells still clanged from collapsed towers, swinging wildly in their ruins, as if the city itself were tolling its own requiem. Those who had survived wandered in shock. Their faces were grey with soot, their clothes torn and bloodied. Children called for parents who would never answer. Monks staggered barefoot through the rubble, clutching charred crucifixes. Dogs howled endlessly, confused by the scent of smoke and flesh. The cries of the wounded blended with the hiss of collapsing timbers and the endless crackle of fire. The quake, the tsunami, and now the inferno. Each disaster had followed the other like a divine rhythm, leaving behind not fear but numb disbelief. The fires, though, were the most merciless of all. They did not come from a single blaze, but from thousands of smaller ones. Candles toppled in churches, oil lamps overturned in homes, hearths thrown into chaos when the floors beneath them split open. The city's tight medieval layout, its timber-framed houses and narrow lanes, made it a perfect furnace. Flames leapt from balcony to balcony, fed by wind sweeping in from the sea. Every gust fanned the blaze, until it roared like a living creature. Those who had escaped the earthquake found themselves surrounded by fire. With the riverfront drowned and the lower city consumed, many fled uphill toward the open spaces of the Rocio and Saint-Roch. The journey was perilous, streets cracked underfoot, collapsing into fissures that opened like jaws. Smoke blinded the path ahead. The heat was so intense that the air itself shimmered, and even the stones radiated it. From the hills above Lisbon, survivors could see the city's death in full. The flames rolled through the Baixa like an advancing army, their orange glow reflecting off the smoke-choked sky. The once grand royal palace, home to priceless paintings, royal archives, and the entire Portuguese library was gone. The opera house, which had opened only months earlier, was a blackened ruin. Ships in the harbour burned where they lay, their masts collapsing into molten water. And yet, amid the horror, strange fragments of life continued. Groups gathered on the outskirts, tending to the wounded, offering scraps of food and sips of wine salvaged from broken barrels. Priests moved among them, murmuring prayers, though some seemed as lost as those they tried to comfort. Families built makeshift shelters of cloth and timber, anything to ward off the cold night air. Fires glowed in the distance like a false dawn, and the stars above were invisible through the haze. The fires burned for 6 days, unstoppable. There was little water to fight them with. The city's aqueducts were shattered, the wells choked with debris. Soldiers and civilians tried to dig trenches to block the flames, but each effort failed as wind carried sparks into the next quarter. The once prosperous city of gold had become a smouldering wasteland. When dawn finally broke on the 7th day, Lisbon was gone. Nearly 85% of the city centre, its cathedrals, libraries, theatres, mansions and warehouses, was reduced to ash. Only fragments of the upper districts and parts of the Alfama survived, spared by the rocky terrain that had absorbed less of the quake's shock. The Tagus River lay still again, reflecting the ruins of what had once been one of the richest ports in Europe. News of the disaster spread quickly. In Porto, tremors had toppled buildings and killed hundreds. Across the sea in Morocco, the city of Meknes was heavily damaged. Even in faraway London, chandeliers trembled, and in Paris, the vibrations rattled window panes. Churches across Europe rang their bells in mourning for Lisbon, but also in fear. If a catastrophe so enormous could strike such a devout city, what did that mean for the rest of Christendom? For Lisbon's survivors, however, there was no time for philosophy, only for survival. Thousands camped in fields outside the city, forming a ghostly sea of tents and makeshift shelters. The royal family had fled to the countryside, setting up a temporary court in tents near Ajuda. King José de Fefan, traumatized by what he had seen, developed such a deep fear of walls and ceilings that he would never again live in a palace made of stone. For the rest of his reign, he ruled from canvas pavilions, a king literally displaced by his own kingdom's ruin. And yet, even in the midst of chaos, something remarkable began to happen. As the flames died and the smoke cleared, the survivors turned not only to mourning, but to rebuilding. The man who led that effort was the king's chief minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. While the court and clergy interpreted the earthquake as divine punishment, Pombal saw it as a test of human resolve. His orders were clear and ruthless: bury the dead and feed the living. It became his motto. He organized soldiers to prevent looting, ordered mass burials at sea to ward off plague, and began rationing food and water. Under his command, the chaos slowly gave way to grim efficiency. But that first week after the quake was still a vision of apocalypse. The smell of smoke lingered for miles, the air thick with ash. Fishermen on the Atlantic reported finding debris and corpses floating for days after. Birds avoided the city, circling high above, but never landing. The landscape looked bleached, scorched, alien. For many it seemed that Lisbon had been erased, not just from geography, but from the favour of heaven itself. In those ashes, however, something new would take root. The ruins would become a laboratory for modern ideas, for science, for reason, for resilience. The catastrophe that destroyed Lisbon would, in time, rebuild it and reshape the way Europe thought about the world, about nature, and about the role of God in disaster. But for now, in that first week, all that remained was silence, the kind that follows the end of everything. When the ground finally fell quiet and the fires began to die, those who survived the inferno found themselves standing in a city that no longer had a shape. The twisting medieval streets were gone, replaced by an open landscape of rubble, scorched beams, and collapsed facades. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke and salt. Every breath carried the stench of burnt wood and charred flesh, and somewhere far beyond the ruins, along the edges of the Tagus, a new terror was building. At first it was just a strange pull in the air, a hush that swept over the river. Those who stood near the waterfront noticed the water behaving oddly again. The tide receded rapidly, draining away as if sucked into the earth. The ships that had survived the first onslaught leaned heavily onto the exposed mud. Fish flopped in the shallows. Some survivors, desperate for anything they could salvage, rushed forward once more. Men with nets, children laughing as they chased stranded crabs. They didn't understand. Then came the sound. A low, thunderous roar rose from the horizon, deep and continuous, like 1,000 cannons firing beneath the sea. The ground seemed to vibrate in sympathy. People turned to look east, toward the Atlantic mouth of the Tagus, and there, above the line of the horizon, was something that did not belong. A wall of water gleaming white with sunlight, advancing like a living thing. The tsunami had been born hundreds of kilometers away, triggered by the same quake that had split Lisbon apart. Its waves had rolled outward across the Atlantic, reaching the coasts of North Africa, England, even the Caribbean. But here at the edge of Europe, it arrived like judgment itself. Those who had rushed toward the river were the first to vanish. The wave struck with unimaginable force, lifting ships from the harbor and flinging them into the streets like toys. A 500-ton warship was thrown clear across the quay, crushing entire families beneath it. The Royal Customs House disintegrated under the impact. Buildings along the waterfront cracked open as the waves surged through their windows, filling upper floors before shattering outward in explosions of debris. The surge swept up the Baixia, the city's lower commercial district, which had already been flattened by the quake. Water rushed through its ruins, turning alleys into rivers and squares into whirlpools. Those who had fled to rooftops clung to chimneys or floating beams as the current dragged carriages, furniture, livestock, and corpses past them. For a few minutes, the entire lower city became an extension of the sea, a churning cauldron of water and wreckage. Then, as quickly as it came, the water began to recede. It pulled everything with it: wreckage, bodies, entire sections of walls. People who had survived both the earthquake and the fire were sucked out toward the Atlantic, their screams fading into the roar of the retreating tide. A second wave followed, smaller but still deadly. The tsunami reached as far inland as the Carmo convent and the foot of São Jorge Castle, flooding areas that had never before seen seawater. Further down the coast, towns like Cascais and Setúbal were struck just as hard. The fishing village of Alcácer do Sal, miles upriver, reported that the tide rose and fell 3 times, leaving behind wrecked boats tangled in vineyards. In Morocco, across the strait, the same wave struck Tangier and Agadir, washing away hundreds of homes. Even in southern England, ports recorded strange tides, and sailors in the Caribbean felt the aftershocks as subtle but unmistakable oscillations in the water. Lisbon's disaster had crossed oceans. When the water finally withdrew for good, it left behind a landscape that defied belief. The quays were stripped bare, the great plaza by the river, the Praça do Comércio, was a field of broken stone, ship timbers, and dead animals. Masts protruded from collapsed roofs. The royal warehouses were gone, their riches scattered across the seabed. The few surviving ships floated in circles, their anchors lost, their crews stunned. In the upper parts of the city, survivors watched the destruction in horrified silence. The roar of the waves had been louder than cannon fire. They could see the massive surge swallowing whole districts, then retreating to reveal nothing but wreckage. For many, it was too much. Some fell to their knees in prayer, convinced that the end of the world had truly arrived. Others fled to the hills outside the city, desperate to reach ground that felt safe beneath their feet. But safety was an illusion. Even on higher ground, aftershocks continued to roll through the earth. At least 2 more major tremors struck that day, toppling what little still stood. Every sound made people flinch. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind through the ruins. The trauma of the morning had fused into their bones. As night fell, the survivors gathered wherever they could find open space fields, courtyards, the ruins of gardens. Fires burned everywhere, some for warmth, others still raging uncontrolled through the city's remains. The reflection of the flames danced on the river's dark surface, turning it red. Mothers tried to hush crying children. Priests whispered psalms over the wounded. Horses lay dying beside their carriages, their flanks heaving. A thick haze of smoke and ash covered everything, blotting out the stars. In the distance the Tagus River hissed and steamed, as fires near the waterfront met seawater. The heat was still so intense that when the waves had come, they boiled in places, leaving a sulphurous vapor in their wake. The survivors coughed and gagged, their throats raw from smoke. For many, thirst became as deadly as the quake itself. Wells were poisoned with debris, the aqueducts shattered, and even the rain tasted of ash. Those who had lost everything. The majority of the city's people slept under makeshift tents of sailcloth or rags, clinging to the few possessions they'd managed to carry. Every few hours, a tremor would roll through the ground again, rattling what little remained of Lisbon. People would wake screaming, certain the earth was about to open again. When morning came, there was only silence and the faint lapping of waves against the blackened shore. The Tagus glistened innocently under a pale sun, as if nothing had happened. But the survivors knew better. Somewhere beneath those calm waters lay thousands of the dead friends, family, neighbors, and the treasures of a city that had once ruled an empire. In the following days, more waves would strike, smaller but cruel reminders that the sea itself had turned against them. The Tagus had taken back the wealth it had given, swallowing Lisbon's glory whole. And in the minds of those who watched, one thought kept repeating itself. If the earth could tremble and the sea could rise on All Saints' Day, then perhaps the world had no mercy left at all. By the second day, word of Lisbon's destruction had spread beyond the smoking hills that ringed the city. Riders galloped north toward Porto, east toward Évora, and south to the Algarve, carrying wild stories of the sea, swallowing ships, of fire raining from heaven, of churches collapsing mid-mass. Some thought the apocalypse had begun, others insisted it was punishment for human pride. But the truth was worse in its simplicity. It was nature, unbound and indifferent. The earth beneath Portugal had ripped open along a fault that stretched deep into the Atlantic. The shock had raced outward, shaking the entire Iberian Peninsula and far beyond. In Spain, the cities of Seville and Córdoba felt it violently, bells ringing on their own, towers swaying. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, Morocco's coast was devastated. Tangier, Fez, and Meknes suffered thousands of deaths as walls crumbled and houses toppled. In Algiers, terrified fishermen reported waves rising higher than the masts of their ships. Even in northern Europe, people felt the tremors. In Paris, chandeliers swung in palaces and taverns alike. In London, the waters of the Thames sloshed against the docks as though tugged by an invisible hand. Seismographs did not yet exist, but the letters and diaries of the time recorded what science would later confirm. This was one of the most powerful earthquakes in modern history, its shockwaves traveling across continents and oceans. Lisbon itself, though, bore the worst of it. In the days following the disaster, the city continued to shake intermittently. Aftershocks struck without warning, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong enough to topple half-standing walls. Each tremor sent survivors fleeing from their tents into the open, clutching one another, eyes wide with terror. The ground felt untrustworthy now, a living thing that could betray them again at any moment. Food grew scarce. The great warehouses that had once stored grain and salted cod were gone, their contents consumed by fire or swept away by the sea. Markets no longer existed. Prices soared overnight. A single loaf of bread could cost a month's wages. Desperation brought out both the best and worst in people. Some shared what they had, cooking over small fires, feeding strangers. Others turned to looting, prying open collapsed shops and stabbing one another over barrels of wine or bolts of cloth. Disease threatened next. The heat from the smouldering ruins, combined with thousands of unburied corpses, created a stench that rolled over the hills like fog. Stray dogs picked at bodies. Flies gathered in black clouds. Survivors covered their faces with scarves, soaked in vinegar or wine to block the smell. Rumors spread that the dead carried plague, that pestilence would finish what the quake had begun. The royal court, camped outside the city, was paralyzed by fear and confusion. King José I, shaken to his core, could barely speak of returning to Lisbon. The courtiers argued over divine meaning while the people starved. The clergy, too, split in their response. Some called for processions of repentance, demanding the survivors kneel in ash and beg forgiveness. Others simply fled to safer towns. Amid the chaos, one man acted. The Marquis of Pombal, the king's minister, strode through the camp, issuing orders with the calm of someone who had decided that emotion was useless. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he said, a phrase that became law by noon. Under his direction, soldiers were sent into the ruins. They rounded up looters and hanged them on the spot to restore order. The corpses that littered the streets were collected, loaded onto carts and taken to the riverfront. There they were weighted with stones and dumped into the Tagus to prevent disease. It was a horrifying sight, but a practical one. Pombal understood that hesitation meant death for everyone. He ordered bakeries to resume production using grain from the countryside. Food was distributed under guard to prevent riots. Water was brought in barrels from nearby springs. Temporary hospitals were established in the surviving convents. In a matter of days, the chaos began to take on a grim rhythm. The fires still burned in some quarters, but for the first time since the morning of All Saints' Day, there was something resembling control. Beyond Lisbon, the rest of Europe watched in horror. Reports arrived in London and Paris weeks later, each one worse than the last. Pamphlets circulated with lurid descriptions, the ground swallowing people whole, rivers turning to fire, the sun darkened at noon. Preachers thundered from pulpits that this was proof of divine wrath. How else could such catastrophe strike on a holy day, in one of Christendom's most devout capitals? But others began to ask different questions. Philosophers, especially those in the coffee houses of France, wondered whether perhaps this was not God's punishment at all, but nature's indifferent machinery. Was it not possible, they asked, that earthquakes followed their own laws, unrelated to virtue or sin? That idea, whispered first in private, would soon ignite a revolution in thought. Back in Portugal, however, philosophy could wait. Pombal ordered a census of survivors, sending messengers to every parish in the country with written questionnaires. How long did the shaking last? Which direction did the buildings fall? Did animals behave strangely before the quake? It was an extraordinary act for the 18th century, a methodical attempt to collect data rather than divine signs. It marked the birth of modern seismology, centuries before the word existed. But science was small comfort to the grieving. Each new report added to the scale of the tragedy. In Lisbon alone, as many as 40,000 people were dead. Across Portugal and North Africa, perhaps 70,000 to 100,000 in total. The numbers were so vast that they ceased to make sense. They became part of the background, like the smoke still curling from the ruins. For days after, the sky remained hazy, the sun a dull red disk. At night, the horizon glowed faintly from the embers of what had been one of Europe's richest cities. Ships that approached the coast reported the smell of ash miles before they sighted land. Travelers who entered Lisbon for the first time in the following weeks wrote that it was like walking through the bones of a giant white dust, silence and the occasional sound of a wall giving way somewhere far off. And yet, among the ruins, the people endured. They gathered in prayer, in silence, in rebuilding. The question that now haunted them all was not how to survive, but how to begin again. When the sun rose again over the ruins, it revealed a city that no longer seemed human. Columns of smoke drifted lazily upward, the once bright tiles of Lisbon now powdered grey and white, the air thick with the ghostly smell of lime and ash. The fires had burned for 6 days and nights, and though they were finally dying, they left behind a silence, far heavier than the roar that had preceded them. The few remaining birds circled overhead, cautious, as if unsure that the ground below was safe. The Lisbon of palaces, theatres and golden churches was gone. In the distance, the Tagus River gleamed with eerie calm, concealing beneath its surface the hundreds of bodies and wrecked ships dumped there by soldiers in their desperate fight against disease. Along its banks, soldiers in scorched uniforms patrolled with grim efficiency, keeping survivors away from the water. The Marquis of Pombal's orders had been clear: control the city, prevent plague, restore order, and somehow, through sheer force of will, he had begun to succeed. Within days he established military patrols, rationed food, and began coordinating teams to clear rubble. Lisbon became a worksite of grief. Lines of men hauled stone and timber, clearing the streets of corpses and debris. Priests moved among them, offering last rites to the dead they found, though there were too many for ceremony. By Pombal's decree, funerals were forbidden. The living cannot bury the dead, he had said. They must rebuild instead. Despite the minister's efficiency, despair weighed heavily. Families wandered through the ruins, searching for loved ones, calling names that would never be answered. Children were found sitting beside the bodies of their parents, dazed, unable to speak. The city's hospitals, those that still stood, were overrun with the wounded. People burned, crushed, or half drowned. The air inside them stank of smoke and blood. Beyond the human toll lay another devastation, the loss of memory itself. The royal archives containing centuries of Portugal's history had been destroyed. Thousands of documents, records of exploration, trade, royal decrees were gone forever. The royal library, one of the finest in Europe, had burned to the ground, its manuscripts reduced to ash that now drifted across the city like snow. Even art had perished. Paintings by Titian and Rubens vanished in the flames. The royal chapel, once famous for its gilded ceiling, now gaped open to the sky. For the first time in centuries, Lisbon was not a city of faith and wealth. It was a graveyard. Still, the fires had accomplished what the quake could not. They erased the old Lisbon completely. What had survived the shaking? The timber houses, the crooked medieval lanes, was now ash. The city's medieval soul was gone. In its place, Pombal saw a blank slate, a chance to build something new, something rational and modern, but for now, that vision lived only in his mind. As he walked the ruins, accompanied by surveyors and soldiers, Pombal spoke little. His face was hard, his eyes hidden behind smoke-stained spectacles. He took notes constantly, measuring the width of surviving streets, estimating the thickness of surviving walls, sketching plans in the margins of burned paper. Around him, Lisbon's survivors moved like shadows. They barely noticed him. That week, Pombal established his emergency council, a temporary government composed of military officers, engineers, and merchants. They worked in tents outside the city, where the air was still breathable. Their first tasks were simple but essential: secure food supplies, establish public order, and prevent epidemics. The next, far more ambitious, would be to rebuild the capital from the ground up. For now, though, Lisbon's population hovered on the edge of starvation. Crops in nearby fields had been flattened by aftershocks. Roads were impassable, and trade from the colonies was interrupted. In the hills beyond the city, thousands of refugees lived in makeshift camps, subsisting on meager rations of bread and soup. Each night, the sound of coughing carried through the camps. Each morning, soldiers collected the dead. The king, too, had changed. José, once a proud and confident monarch, was now a shell of himself. He refused to enter any stone building, sleeping only in elaborate pavilions erected on the outskirts of Lisbon. His fear of enclosed spaces was absolute. He even held court in a large tent draped with royal insignia, where nobles in embroidered coats shuffled nervously through the mud to receive his orders. From this strange, open-air palace, the king ruled an empire in ruin. In that tent, Pombal reported daily, his tone brisk and unyielding. "Your Majesty," he would say, "the city burns still, but the people live. That is what matters." The king would nod, but his eyes were always distant, haunted by memories of collapsing churches and roaring fire. Meanwhile, across Europe, the shockwaves of Lisbon's destruction rippled outward in ways few expected. Newspapers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam printed illustrations of the disaster, some exaggerated, some eerily accurate. Readers gasped at reports that tens of thousands had died in a single morning. Churches across the continent held masses for the dead, while philosophers began to argue in salons and pamphlets about what it all meant. Was Lisbon's destruction divine punishment for sin, as priests insisted, or was it the work of natural forces, earth, fire, and water indifferent to human virtue? The question began to divide Europe. Some theologians claimed the quake was God's way of humbling the proud Portuguese who had grown rich on colonial gold and slave trade. Others, less sure, asked why the wicked had survived while the innocent women, children, monks, had perished. One pamphleteer wrote bitterly, "Did God strike the churches because they were too full, or because they were not full enough?" It was a dangerous question in an age still ruled by faith. But it marked the beginning of a new kind of thinking, one that would shape Europe's future. Back in Lisbon, as winter approached, the first plans for rebuilding took form. Pombal's engineers began sketching grids, straight, wide boulevards designed to prevent fires from spreading again. The new city, he declared, would not be a maze of medieval alleys, but a city of logic and light. It would be stronger than before, a testament to resilience. But to build it, he first had to ensure that Lisbon survived the winter. And so, beneath the thin November sun, men continued to clear the ruins. Women carried buckets of water to wash soot from their children's faces. Priests, led quiet prayers at the edges of mass graves. From the ashes of disaster, a strange and fragile order emerged. The city was broken, but the will to endure had not yet died. By the time the fires were extinguished and the aftershocks faded into distant tremors, Lisbon had become a study in both ruin and rebirth. Out of the haze of dust and despair, one figure stood out, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal, whose name would forever be tied to the city's reconstruction. To most of Lisbon's survivors, he appeared less a politician than a force of nature, brisk, cold, unstoppable. In an empire paralyzed by grief, he alone seemed immune to it. His first task was survival, and he approached it with ruthless practicality. In the week after the disaster, he established emergency supply chains, bringing food and fresh water from the countryside under armed escort. He ordered the collection of corpses to continue day and night, dumping thousands into the sea to ward off pestilence. Priests protested. Pombal ignored them. Better scandal than disease, he said. By December the fires had died, but hunger and cold threatened to kill as many as the quake itself. Pombal's soldiers distributed bread to the refugees who filled the hills outside the city. Tents stretched for miles, ragged improvised shelters built from sails, drapes and fragments of furniture. The once grand courtiers of Lisbon now stood barefoot beside beggars, their finery turned to rags. The royal family, living in silk tents on the outskirts, was no exception. King José himself had not set foot in a stone building since the morning of the earthquake, and would never again. Every day, the Marquis rode through the ruins on horseback, his cloak whipping in the wind, his notebook always in hand. Around him, teams of soldiers and engineers worked to clear the debris. They uncovered half-buried statues, melted bells, and the skeletons of churches that had collapsed mid-mass. He spoke to the workers as if they were part of a machine he alone could see. This city, he told them, must rise cleaner, stronger, and straighter than before. The Baixa, Lisbon's commercial heart, was to be rebuilt from the ground up, but not as it had been, a maze of crooked lanes and timber houses, but as a grid of wide, sunlit streets, each measured and aligned to the same geometric plan. Pombal wanted a modern city, one that embodied reason and control, rather than chaos and faith. He summoned Portugal's best architects Manuel de Maia, Eugênio dos Santos, and others to design what would become known as the Pombaline city. In January 1756, as winter rains washed the last of the ash into the river, they began the first survey of the ruins. Pombal's men measured every surviving wall and foundation, noting which areas of the city had fared best. It became clear that the lower Baixa had suffered the worst, built on soft alluvial soil near the river. It had amplified the quake's motion. The upper districts, resting on bedrock, had fared better. From this observation came a radical idea. Buildings could be designed to resist earthquakes. The engineers began experimenting. They built wooden models of new buildings and tested them by marching troops around them to simulate tremors. The resulting design, a flexible wooden lattice hidden inside the walls, became the world's first anti-seismic structure, later known as the Pombaline Cage. The city would literally be rebuilt to withstand the same earth that had once destroyed it. But while the architects drew their plans, the population struggled to survive. Disease still loomed. Many who had escaped the quake now died of exposure or infection. Food remained scarce. Bread lines stretched for hours. Pombal's decrees were relentless. Anyone caught looting or hoarding would hang. Public executions were staged to remind everyone that order had returned. It was harsh, but effective. The chaos that had consumed Lisbon in the first days was now replaced by something equally intense: discipline. The church, once the city's moral center, had lost much of its authority. Its palaces were gone, its bishops scattered. Some preachers claimed the quake was divine punishment, that Lisbon's sins had brought about its ruin. Pombal would have none of it. When one Jesuit priest insisted that the disaster was proof of God's wrath, Pombal reportedly snapped, "Then let us see if His Excellency can rebuild his temples himself." He soon moved to suppress the Jesuits altogether, beginning a campaign that would eventually lead to their expulsion from Portugal. To the survivors, Pombal's methods were brutal, but they worked. Roads were cleared, markets reopened, and ships once again arrived at the harbour. Refugees began to return to the city, not out of joy, but necessity. The work of rebuilding promised wages, and the hope, however faint, that Lisbon might live again. Meanwhile, the Marquis's correspondence with Europe's capitals revealed a man already thinking beyond disaster. He wrote to London, requesting financial aid and engineers. He instructed Portugal's ambassadors to spread news, not of divine punishment but of progress. Lisbon, he declared, would be the first rational city of the modern age. Under his orders, teams of draftsmen drew detailed blueprints of the new city. The Praça do Comércio, once the Royal Palace Square, would be rebuilt as a great civic plaza facing the river, an open symbol of trade, order, and reason. The streets would run in perfect symmetry, each the same width, each connecting to another at right angles. The new houses would all share the same height and style, forming clean, uniform facades. It was the beginning of urban planning as we know it today. Not everyone approved. The old aristocracy mourned their lost palaces and privileges. They whispered that Pombal was using the earthquake to seize power, that he ruled like a dictator while the king trembled in his tent. But to most of the survivors, he was the only man keeping them alive. His mixture of science, authority, and pragmatism gave Lisbon something it hadn't had since the quake, a future. And yet, for all his confidence, even Pombal knew how fragile that future was. Each aftershock reminded him that the ground beneath this new city could betray them again. The earth, once silent, had revealed its power, and no amount of reason could make it forget. Still, as spring approached, hammers began to strike stone, and the sound of rebuilding echoed through the ruins. Lisbon would never again be the same, but in its ashes, Europe's modern age had begun to stir. As the months passed and winter turned into spring, Lisbon's transformation began to take shape, not in marble or grandeur yet, but in something subtler, order. The chaos of the first weeks had hardened into a strange new discipline. Soldiers patrolled the streets to keep the peace. Carpenters built temporary wooden houses in neat rows, and Pombal's engineers walked the ruins with maps and measuring rods. The once sprawling medieval city had been reduced to a dusty plain dotted with tents, scaffolds, and half-buried walls. But beneath the devastation there was purpose. For the ordinary survivors, life was still grim. Thousands lived in makeshift shelters outside the city, dependent on rations. Children grew up amid smoke-stained ruins, playing among broken stones that had once been their homes. Every day began with the same routine, standing in line for bread, fetching water from barrels, and working for whatever small wages the reconstruction offered. Those who had once been merchants, artisans, or even minor nobles now laboured alongside peasants, all distinctions erased by the catastrophe. The Marquis of Pombal moved constantly between the construction sites and the royal encampment, issuing orders in his clipped military tone. He seemed incapable of fatigue, surviving on coffee and anger. When courtiers complained that rebuilding was impossible, he silenced them with a single phrase: "The dead cannot return, but the living must build," and so they built. Lisbon, under his vision, was to become a monument to human resilience. Pombal's architects drew up new designs that looked nothing like the old city. Gone were the twisting lanes and crowded alleyways. In their place would rise broad, straight boulevards and uniform buildings. The Pombaline downtown, as it would later be called, was planned with mathematical precision. Each block was rectangular, each facade identical, each street wide enough for soldiers to march in formation, and for fire to be contained should disaster ever strike again. The design of the new buildings was revolutionary. Instead of heavy stone walls that crumbled under seismic shock, Pombal's engineers devised a wooden lattice frame, hidden within the masonry, known as the Pombaline cage. This flexible structure could absorb vibrations and resist collapse. To test their invention, the engineers famously set up full-scale models, and had troops march around them to mimic an earthquake. The new Lisbon would not just be beautiful, it would be nearly indestructible. While engineers drafted blueprints, Pombal turned his attention to the living. He had seen enough death to know that chaos killed faster than any tremor. His decrees came daily and left no room for mercy. Price gouging was punishable by hanging. Looting meant death. Anyone who spread rumors of divine punishment was imprisoned. He even forbade public processions of repentance, arguing that prayer was no substitute for rebuilding. To the Marquis, faith without order was madness. But to many of Lisbon's priests and monks, Pombal's rule felt blasphemous. They accused him of arrogance, of usurping God's authority. Rumors spread that he planned to confiscate church property to fund his rebuilding efforts, and they were not wrong. When the Jesuits resisted his policies, Pombal retaliated with vengeance. He accused them of sedition, blaming them for inciting unrest after the earthquake, and soon began a campaign that would end with their expulsion from Portugal. This confrontation between faith and reason became the defining struggle of post-quake Lisbon. While the clergy preached repentance, Pombal preached progress. While they spoke of sin, he spoke of physics. To one side, the disaster was divine retribution. To the other, it was a test of human intellect. The earthquake had not only broken buildings, it had split the soul of Europe in two. Even outside Portugal, the debate raged. In France, the philosopher Voltaire wrote his famous poem Sur le désastre de Lisbonne, asking bitterly how an all-good, all-powerful God could allow tens of thousands to die, while the innocent prayed. "Will you say this is punishment for sin, while infants perish at their mothers' breasts?" he wrote. His words spread like wildfire across Europe, shaking the very foundations of traditional theology. The Lisbon earthquake had become not just a natural disaster but a philosophical earthquake, one that tore through the minds of thinkers from Paris to Vienna. For Pombal, however, such questions were distractions. He was not interested in philosophy. He was interested in results. He continued his campaign of reconstruction with mechanical precision. The old Praça ao Comércio, once the seat of royal power, was redesigned as a grand public square facing the Tagus River. It would no longer house palaces, but ministries and warehouses. A symbol not of divine authority but of civic order, the new Lisbon would belong not to kings or bishops, but to the state and its citizens. Still, progress came slowly. Materials had to be imported from the countryside and the colonies. Skilled labor was scarce. Many artisans had perished in the quake. Money was scarcer still. Portugal's wealth, once drawn from Brazilian gold and Indian spices, was crippled by the disaster. To fund the reconstruction, Pombal imposed new taxes on trade and the nobility. The rich grumbled, but none dared oppose him openly. Even the king deferred to his minister's will, preferring to remain in his tent palace, far from the dust and noise of rebuilding. By 1756, the outlines of the new Lisbon had begun to emerge. Roads were levelled, sewers dug, and the first Pombaline buildings rose from the ruins, their white facades gleaming in the sun. The rhythm of hammering, sawing, and cartwheels filled the air. For the first time since All Saints' Day, the city began to sound alive again. Still, the scars of the quake remained everywhere. At night, the survivors lit small fires and told stories of the morning the world ended, of the earth opening like the sea, of the tsunami that swallowed the harbour, of churches collapsing mid-prayer. Some wept, others grew silent. Everyone had lost someone. And beneath their grief ran a new, quiet fear that the ground might one day shake again. Every tremor of wind against a tent flap made hearts race. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattle of a wheel, each one a ghost of that dreadful sound. But the city endured. The smoke had cleared, and from its ashes rose something entirely new. Not the Lisbon of saints and kings, but the Lisbon of reason, geometry, and steel will. The Marquis of Pombal had turned tragedy into a blueprint for modernity, and as Europe watched, awed and uncertain, it began to realize that the disaster had not just remade a city, it had remade an age. By the spring of 1757, a strange paradox had settled over Lisbon. The city was still a ruin, yet it had never been more alive. From dawn until dusk, the clang of hammers and the scrape of shovels echoed through the air. Every street was a workshop. Blacksmiths forged tools from melted church bells, carpenters shaped beams from charred wood, and masons hauled stones from the shattered convents to lay the first foundations of the new city. The smell of dust and sawdust replaced that of death and smoke. Lisbon was still wounded, but it was breathing again. At the centre of it all was the Marquis of Pombal, relentless as ever. His tent office, set up near the riverbank, had become the empire's true capital. Couriers came and went in waves, their boots caked with mud and soot. Clerks scribbled orders by candlelight. Architects arrived with rolled plans under their arms, waiting nervously for the minister's verdict. Pombal's temper was legend. He had been known to throw blueprints into the fire if a line displeased him, but his vision was absolute. He saw in the ashes not loss but opportunity. The new Lisbon, he declared, would be rational, symmetrical, and indestructible. He wanted streets that aligned with the compass, squares that opened to the river, and buildings that could sway without falling. The architects Eugenio dos Santos and Carlos Mardel embraced the challenge. Together they laid out a plan so bold that foreign engineers would later call it the miracle of geometry. The grid of the Baixa Pombalina, as it came to be known, was unlike anything else in Europe. 12 perfectly straight streets, each of equal width, ran parallel to the Tagus, intersected by 9 others at right angles. In the center, 3 great squares would anchor the new city: the Praça do Comércio, opening to the river, the Rocio, heart of public life, and the Praça da Figueira, a market and meeting ground. Between them, Pombal's new buildings would rise, 3 stories tall, identical in height, shape, and facade. The age of medieval chaos was over. This was order incarnate. But order came at a cost. To clear the space for construction, thousands of survivors had to be relocated from the ruins. Many resisted, unwilling to leave the remnants of their homes or shops. Others refused on principle. They believed that rebuilding over the dead was a sin. Pombal, unmoved, issued his decree. The living must not live in cemeteries. Soldiers arrived to enforce it. The ruins were emptied, and work began. Day after day, ships arrived in the harbour carrying supplies: timber from Brazil, tiles from Porto, marble from Alentejo. From dawn to nightfall, ox-drawn carts rumbled through the ruins, hauling rubble out and materials in. Pombal's inspectors stalked the work sites with clipboards, ensuring every measurement matched the grand plan. He personally approved the colour of facades, the spacing of windows, even the design of street lamps. Nothing escaped his attention. The people had mixed feelings about this new Lisbon. Some admired the order, the cleanliness, the sense of safety the new buildings promised. Others found it soulless, stripped of the winding charm of the old city. "It looks like a chessboard," one noblewoman complained. "Not a home." To which Pombal famously replied, "It is a chessboard on which the next generations will play their lives more safely." While Lisbon rebuilt, the rest of Europe watched in astonishment. Letters from travellers described a city being reborn in real time. One English merchant wrote, "Here one sees reason and ruin walk hand in hand. They build atop death itself." Philosophers and engineers visited to study Pombal's methods, fascinated by the way he had imposed logic upon chaos. For the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, Lisbon had become a living experiment, a city reconstructed according to the laws of geometry and science rather than superstition and faith. But not everyone was impressed. Among Portugal's aristocracy, resentment festered. Pombal's centralization of power had reduced them to bystanders. The nobles who once controlled Lisbon's guilds and trade now found themselves subject to the minister's decrees. He had even taxed them to fund the rebuilding. "He rules like a king," they whispered bitterly, "and the king obeys." And indeed, King José did obey, traumatized by the earthquake, terrified of enclosed spaces, and dependent on Pombal's iron will. He rarely opposed him. Portugal, once ruled by divine right, was now ruled by sheer administrative force. The clergy, too, had reason to fear him. Pombal saw the church as both a rival and a relic. After the earthquake, many priests had preached that Lisbon's destruction was divine punishment for sin. Pombal saw it as an insult to reason and to his authority. He responded by stripping the church of its privileges and placing education under state control. In time, his campaign would culminate in the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portugal in 1759, an act that would shock all of Europe. Meanwhile, the survivors went on with their lives in whatever ways they could. Markets reopened along the rebuilt avenues. Children began attending new public schools, built at Pombal's direction. Carpenters and stonemasons found steady work rebuilding the same city that had once crushed their families. Slowly, the smell of fresh plaster replaced that of ash. And yet, at night, the memory of the quake haunted everyone. Old women claimed they could still feel the ground shift beneath their beds. Men who had lost families refused to enter churches, still fearing collapse. Priests prayed over empty pews. Even the new buildings, though designed to flex and bend with the earth, seemed fragile under the weight of memory. The sea, too, remained a symbol of terror. Few dared to swim in the Tagus, and fishermen murmured prayers each time they launched their boats. Many claimed the river still held ghosts, but on certain nights you could hear the bells of drowned churches ringing beneath the waves. But fear, like everything else, eventually hardened into habit. Lisbon's citizens learned to live with their ghosts. The new city rose slowly, its whitewashed facades gleaming against the blue of the river, its avenues filled again with merchants and chat, and in the evenings, As the sun set over the Tagus, its light reflected off the ordered streets and identical rooftops, giving the city a strange, deliberate beauty, one born not of faith, but of endurance. What Lisbon had lost in grandeur, it gained in resilience. Its spirit had shifted from devotion to determination, from worship to willpower. The earthquake had taught its people a cruel lesson, that even the most pious city could burn, and that salvation, if it existed at all, must be built by human hands. Even as new walls rose and streets straightened, the true measure of the Lisbon earthquake's legacy was written not in stone, but in lives. The city's reconstruction had given survivors a reason to move, to sweat, to eat, but grief lingered like the dust in their lungs. Every person had lost someone, and everywhere you looked were the scars of memory. A blackened church facade stood like a tombstone. The shell of the Carmo convent, its Gothic arches open to the sky, was left as it had fallen, a silent monument to the thousands who had perished mid-prayer. Pombal forbade rebuilding it. He wanted it to remain ruined, so that Lisbon will never forget what the earth can do. The people obeyed. They began to call it the city's wound, a wound that never healed, but simply became part of the landscape. But beyond Lisbon's borders, the ripples of that morning still spread across Europe. Theologians, scientists, and philosophers argued fiercely about what had happened. It wasn't just a natural disaster anymore, it was a moral crisis. How could an all-loving God allow tens of thousands of faithful worshippers to be crushed in churches on a holy day? The debate tore through salons, universities, and pulpits from Paris to Berlin. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, published his poem on the disaster of Lisbon, turning outrage into art. His verses mocked those who preached that all is for the best in God's plan. "Say, priests, who teach that all things are arranged," he wrote, "have you not seen this heap of victims crushed? This earth that drinks their blood?" For the first time in centuries, faith and reason stood face to face, and faith blinked. The Lisbon earthquake became a touchstone of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and Voltaire used it to challenge old certainties. Some sought scientific explanations. Kant even published essays proposing that earthquakes arose from movements of gas and pressure within the earth, not divine punishment. Others asked harder questions about morality, about suffering, about whether human virtue mattered in a world where nature could erase a city in 6 minutes. Lisbon, once a symbol of Catholic grandeur, had accidentally become the birthplace of modern skepticism. It was ironic the city that burned for its devotion had lit a fire that would burn down superstition across Europe. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the physical rebuilding masked deeper fractures. The country's colonial wealth had always been its lifeline: Brazilian gold, African slaves, Indian spices, but the quake disrupted everything. Warehouses and docks were gone, trade routes crippled, and the royal treasury nearly emptied. Pombal taxed the nobility and merchants heavily, redirecting gold from the colonies to fund the reconstruction. He reformed the bureaucracy, centralized power under the crown, and tightened control over colonial trade. For the first time, Portugal began to act less like an empire of fortune and more like a modern state. But such transformation came with enemies. The aristocracy despised Pombal's iron rule, whispering that he had used the earthquake to crown himself in all but name. The clergy detested his campaign against the Jesuits and his ban on public displays of repentance. Yet, the common people, though they feared him, respected him. To them, he was the man who had saved Lisbon when everyone else had fallen to their knees. By 1759, 3 years after the earthquake, the Baixa Pombalina was beginning to resemble a city again. White buildings lined with black iron balconies rose in symmetrical rows. The Praça do Comércio gleamed like a new stage set, grand, clean and rational. Facing the Tagus as if daring the sea to rise again, a statue of King José on horseback would later stand in its center, cast from bronze melted down from cannon barrels, both a symbol of victory and a reminder of violence. Visitors from across Europe came to marvel. British merchants called it the Phoenix City. French architects praised its geometry, but some Lisboners found it cold, its perfection eerie. They missed the tangled alleys, the scent of roasting chestnuts in crooked streets, the small courtyards hidden behind wooden doors. The new Lisbon was safer, yes, but in its symmetry, it seemed to have lost its soul. At night, the city still whispered. Fishermen claimed to hear bells tolling from beneath the river, the voices of priests chanting from underwater cathedrals. Some said the sea glowed faintly near the harbour, where so many bodies had been thrown. Others swore they saw lights flickering in the ruins of Carmo at midnight. The rational age had arrived, but Lisbon's ghosts had refused to leave. Even Pombal could not silence them. His gaze was fixed forward, on numbers, budgets, and blueprints. But the people carried the past in their bones. They had learned, in a single morning, that stone could crumble and faith could fracture. But the will to live, that strange, stubborn fire, endured. By the late 1760s, Lisbon had fully re-emerged as a modern city. Its wide boulevards bustled again with carts and carriages. Merchants filled its shops. Sailors returned to its docks. The rebuilt Royal Opera House opened with new music, echoing through halls designed with hidden wooden braces to resist future quakes. Theatres, markets, and fountains gleamed in the sunlight. To an outsider, the catastrophe seemed like a story from the past. But for those who had lived through it, the earthquake was never past. It was a living memory, a fault line running through every conversation. Parents told their children, "Remember to sleep near the door." Priests avoided preaching about divine wrath. And when the earth trembled even slightly, people froze, every muscle remembering what their minds tried to forget. In a way, Lisbon itself had become a metaphor for Europe, a continent rising from rubble, trying to balance faith and reason, tradition and progress. The city's symmetry, its geometry, its measured order, all of it spoke of a new belief, not in God, but in human design. Yet beneath those perfect facades, the ghosts of the old world still lingered. Pombal's Lisbon was both monument and warning. It proved that humanity could rebuild after devastation, but also that reason alone could not heal a soul. The city stood firm, but its people remained haunted. And every November, when the bells tolled on All Saints' Day, the sound carried a tremor of memory, the reminder that beneath their beautiful, rational streets, the earth still slept, waiting. By the 1760s, Lisbon no longer smelled of ash, but of lime, sea air, and wet plaster. The city that had once been an open grave was now a living construction site, wrapped in scaffolds and echoing with the ring of chisels. Pombal's new Lisbon was emerging block by block, street by street, a city built not from faith, but from fear conquered by reason. And yet, the human cost of that triumph still weighed heavily on those who remembered the morning when the earth betrayed them. The Baixa Pombalina was now almost complete. Broad boulevards stretched from the river up toward the hills, lined with buildings of strict symmetry, 3 stories tall, white facades, iron balconies and arched arcades at the base. To modern eyes they might have looked graceful, even serene, but to the survivors they were symbols of defiance. Every brick, every beam whispered a single message: "We will not fall again." Inside those uniform walls lay one of the greatest engineering feats of the 18th century. Hidden within the plaster was the Pombaline cage, a wooden lattice that could flex under pressure, absorbing the shock of future quakes. The floors were reinforced, the foundations anchored deep into stone, and the streets designed to provide escape routes should disaster strike again. Even the sewer system, an innovation in itself, was laid with careful precision to prevent flooding. The new Lisbon was an early marvel of urban resilience, decades before such words existed. But while engineers and craftsmen labored in the Baixa, another kind of rebuilding was taking place elsewhere, inside the minds of Europe's thinkers. The Lisbon earthquake had done something few armies or revolutions could achieve. It had shaken the very foundation of belief. In the years following 1755, sermons and pamphlets still described Lisbon as a city punished for its sins, its wealth, its arrogance, its empire built on slavery and gold. But philosophers saw something different. To them, Lisbon represented a world that no longer fit the old patterns of divine order. Voltaire's Candide, published in 1759, turned the disaster into biting satire. In it, his hero witnesses the horrors of Lisbon's destruction and rejects the idea that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. The quake became an argument against blind optimism, against the notion that suffering had meaning simply because God willed it. Others, like Immanuel Kant, took a different lesson. Without ever visiting Lisbon, he wrote 3 essays analyzing the event scientifically, using reports from Portuguese and British ships to estimate the quake's source and magnitude. He concluded that earthquakes were the result of natural forces, pressurized gases beneath the crust, marking one of the earliest steps toward modern seismology. The Lisbon quake, in other words, had turned theology into geology. Even the Vatican could not ignore the shift. Pope Benedict XIV declared days of prayer for the victims, but also quietly commissioned Jesuit scholars to study the phenomenon in natural terms. Across Europe, the idea was taking hold that perhaps disasters were not punishments but processes. The Enlightenment had found one of its defining moments, not in a classroom, but in catastrophe. Meanwhile, Pombal's grip on Portugal grew tighter. His rebuilding of Lisbon was only part of a larger transformation. He reformed the tax system, curbed noble privileges, modernized the navy, and established schools based on mathematics and science rather than Latin and scripture. His rule was autocratic, but efficient. To his admirers, he was the architect of Portugal's modernization. To his enemies, a tyrant who had used tragedy to crown himself in absolute power. In 1759, Pombal made his boldest move yet. He expelled the Jesuits from Portugal and its colonies, accusing them of conspiring against the state. It was an extraordinary act for a Catholic nation. Overnight, the most powerful religious order in Europe was banished, their properties seized, and their schools closed. The Marquis justified it as a matter of public safety and progress. "They built ignorance where I would build knowledge," he said. "Their empire is over." The aftershocks of that decision rippled through Europe as surely as the earthquake itself had. France and Spain would soon follow suit, expelling the Jesuits from their realms. In the shadow of Lisbon's ruins, the Enlightenment was consolidating its victory. But not all was progress. The reconstruction strained Portugal's treasury. The colonies sent less gold than expected. Trade with Brazil and Africa was slow to recover. Inflation rose, and famine struck in the countryside. While Lisbon gleamed with new marble facades, peasants starved in the interior provinces. Critics whispered that Pombal's obsession with grandeur had blinded him to his own people's suffering. The minister ignored them. "The city is the heart," he said coldly. "If the heart does not beat, the body dies." Still, the memory of the quake haunted every decision. Each November, when All Saints' Day returned, the city grew quiet. Churches, those that had been rebuilt, filled with anxious worshippers. Priests kept their sermons short, their voices trembling slightly as they prayed for peace beneath new vaulted ceilings. Outside, the air always seemed too still, the ground too heavy. Even decades later, survivors would mark the hour, 9:40 a.m., with a moment of silence. Children who hadn't been born in 1755 were taught to fear that number. In the countryside, peasants still told stories about the day the earth opened and swallowed Lisbon whole. They said it was a warning, that someday the sea would rise again. Fishermen claimed to see strange ripples in the Tagus, even on calm mornings. The ghosts of the drowned, it was said, still walked the waterfront at night, their footsteps muffled by the sand. And yet, life went on. Ships from England, Holland, and Italy once again docked in Lisbon's port, bringing goods and curiosity. Artists returned to paint the reborn city, scholars came to study its planning. Lisbon had become both a cautionary tale and a model. A city destroyed by nature, rebuilt by will, and reborn as a symbol of modern endurance. By the end of the decade, visitors often forgot that the elegant, symmetrical streets they strolled had once been a field of ashes. The past lay buried beneath the cobblestones, under the steady rhythm of horse hooves and footsteps. But deep down, every Lisboner knew that their city was built on memory, not marble. Pombal's Lisbon was a monument to reason, but it carried an unspoken prayer within it, that the earth would stay still just a little longer. By the late 1760s, Lisbon was gleaming again, reborn, reconstructed, and rationalized into the model city that Pombal had envisioned. The fires, the corpses, the chaos were now memories buried under bright new plaster and broad new avenues. But for the survivors who walked those clean, ordered streets, every corner still whispered of the dead. The air of the Baixa might have smelled of salt and freshly cut stone, but beneath it lingered the ghost of smoke. The Praça do Comércio, now completed, was the pride of the new Lisbon. Where the royal palace had once stood before it collapsed into the river, there was now an immense open square framed by yellow facades and grand arcades. In its centre rose an equestrian statue of King José I, cast in bronze, melted from cannon barrels, salvaged from the quake's wreckage. The king, who still refused to live inside walls, seldom came to see it, but Pombal did. He stood beneath that statue often, his sharp gaze turned toward the river, as if daring the Tagus to rise again. From above, Lisbon now resembled a grid of sunlight. The once chaotic lanes had been replaced by rational order, streets aligned like the lines of a map, each intersection precisely measured, each building uniform in height and structure. Visitors from across Europe arrived to marvel at what had been achieved. British merchants called it the Miracle City. French engineers wrote that it was the triumph of geometry over ruin. Even the Pope sent letters of admiration, though he still privately blamed Lisbon's fall on divine wrath. Yet for all its beauty, the new city was strangely quiet. The churches had been rebuilt, but their bells seemed subdued, their congregations smaller. The people who filled the new streets walked with a kind of reverence for survival. They had learned that everything solid could crumble in a moment. A city that had once been defined by faith now lived under the shadow of doubt. And doubt, as it turned out, had become Lisbon's greatest export. The earthquake had rippled far beyond Portugal's borders. In France, Voltaire had already unleashed Candide, mocking the idea that suffering was part of God's perfect plan. If this is the best of all possible worlds, his hero asks amid the rubble of Lisbon, what must the others be like? The novel's success was explosive. Readers debated whether faith could survive reason's cruel logic. Across Europe, sermons and essays battled for moral ground. Priests preached humility, philosophers demanded evidence. Lisbon, once a distant port city at the edge of the world, had become the center of a war for the European soul. In the salons of Paris, thinkers spoke of a Lisbon effect, the old optimism of the Enlightenment. Its faith in order, reason, and divine benevolence had cracked. Nature, once seen as rational and harmonious, had revealed itself as brutal and indifferent. The quake, the fires, the tsunami, it was too much destruction to fit into tidy theological boxes. For some, it proved that humanity was alone in a dangerous mechanical universe. For others, it demanded compassion. If God would not save us, then only humans could save each other. Meanwhile, back in Portugal, Pombal harnessed this new secular spirit to consolidate his power. He reformed education, replacing Jesuit schools with secular academies that taught mathematics, geography, and natural philosophy. He founded the Royal Academy of Sciences, urging scholars to study the physical world instead of praying to it. He restructured trade laws, established a national wine monopoly, and expanded the navy. His vision of Portugal was pragmatic, efficient, and ruthlessly controlled, a kingdom remade in the image of the man who rebuilt its capital. But the Marquis's rule was not without cruelty. Dissenters were silenced, critics exiled, and opponents accused of treason. The Tavor affair, a conspiracy, real or fabricated, involving noble families suspected of plotting against the king, ended in a public execution that horrified Europe. Pombal, convinced that fear was the price of order, showed none of the mercy he had denied chaos. His Lisbon stood strong, but beneath its symmetry lay the same rigidity that defined its architect. Still, the city flourished. Trade resumed. The port filled again with ships from Brazil, Angola, and Goa, their sails gleaming in the Atlantic sun. The scent of coffee and sugar once again drifted through the markets. Musicians played in the squares, children laughed in the fountains, and foreign travellers described Lisbon as a city born from catastrophe. It was as if Europe had decided to forgive it for its suffering. And yet, even amid prosperity, the memory of 75 remained embedded in the city's rhythm. Every All Saints' Day, the bells tolled slower, softer, as if mourning themselves. Priests still led prayers at 9:40 a.m., the moment when the world had ended. In the hills, old women still whispered stories of that morning, of how the sea had fled and returned like a beast, of how the air had glowed red for days. The young listened wide-eyed, unable to imagine such horror beneath the calm elegance of their rebuilt city. But the earth never truly sleeps. Small tremors continued to ripple through Portugal in the following decades. None came close to matching the violence of 1755, but each sent a shiver through Lisbon's collective spine. When the ground quivered, even slightly, people fell silent. Merchants stopped mid-transaction. Mothers clutched their children. The soldiers on guard at the Praça do Comércio crossed themselves, then quickly pretended they hadn't. The fear of the quake was hereditary, passed down like folklore. Abroad, Lisbon's rebirth became a model for modern urban planning. Cities from Naples to London studied its layout, borrowing its grid system. and anti-seismic innovations. The phrase "to rebuild like Lisbon" entered the vocabulary of engineers and architects, but with admiration came a quiet unease. If such a catastrophe could strike one of Europe's great capitals, then no city was safe. The illusion of stability, moral or physical, had been forever broken. Even Voltaire, late in life, admitted that Lisbon had taught him more about the fragility of humanity than any book could. "The earth," he wrote, "is neither cruel nor kind. It simply is. It moves." Lisbon, the city that had fallen, had moved again, but in a different way. It had shifted the way people thought about faith, about science, about fate itself. It had turned catastrophe into philosophy, tragedy into architecture, and death into data. And as the 18th century drew toward its close, the new Lisbon stood as both triumph and warning, its symmetry a mask, its silence a prayer. Beneath the measured rhythm of its streets, beneath the marble and the math, the same earth that had swallowed the old city waited patiently, unchanged and eternal. As the decades passed, Lisbon settled into its new skin. A city both modern and haunted, a capital of reason, built atop the bones of faith. By the 1770s, the transformation was nearly complete. The once chaotic medieval port had become a marvel of symmetry and order, admired by visiting diplomats, merchants, and artists. To the casual observer, the disaster of 1755 had been conquered, mastered, absorbed into the city's identity, like a scar, polished to perfection. Yet, for those who lived within its walls, the past still murmured beneath the cobblestones. The Marquis of Pombal, aging but unbowed, had achieved what few men in history could claim. He had rebuilt a capital from ruin and reshaped an entire nation's mind in the process. His rule had been harsh, but his results undeniable. Lisbon's grid shone white under the Atlantic sun, its riverfront arcades bustling with trade once more. Ships arrived from Rio de Janeiro loaded with gold and sugar, from Goa with spices, from Luanda with ivory. The sound of their rigging creaked over the same water that had drowned the city 2 decades before. The world seemed stable again, but stability, like the earth beneath Lisbon, was an illusion. Beneath the grand boulevards and painted facades, old tensions simmered. Pombal's relentless centralization had alienated Portugal's aristocracy and clergy alike. The nobles whispered that he was more tyrant than minister, a man who ruled through fear as much as vision. The clergy saw him as the architect of heresy, the destroyer of the Jesuits, and the silencer of the church. Even the common people, who owed him their city, feared his temper and his spies. Lisbon may have been rebuilt, but it now lived under an invisible kind of quake, political rather than physical. The king himself had grown frail and reclusive. José, once the monarch of a global empire, now ruled from his elaborate tent palace on the outskirts of the city. His fear of enclosed spaces had become legend. He held audiences outdoors, beneath canopies fluttering in the wind, his eyes darting at every creak of the ground. Pombal attended these meetings daily, his patience endless, his control absolute. "Lisbon stands," he would say to the trembling king, "because you trusted reason, not fear." And the king, worn and tired, would simply nod. When José died in 1777, the ground shifted once more, but this time, politically. His daughter, Maria the Fierce, ascended to the throne. Deeply devout and openly hostile to Pombal's secularism, she wasted no time reversing much of his work. The old nobility returned from exile. The Jesuits were quietly invited back. Pombal, who had ruled Portugal like a monarch in all but name, found himself dismissed and disgraced. His enemies called it divine justice. The man who had faced fire and earthquake without flinching was undone by politics. Exiled to his estate in Pombal, the Marquis spent his final years writing letters to defend his legacy. "They may unmake my power," he wrote bitterly, "but not my city." And he was right. Lisbon, the city he had forged from destruction, outlived both his rule and his reputation. The streets he had planned, the buildings he had ordered, the logic he had imposed, they all remained. His methods had been ruthless, but his design was enduring. Under Queen Maria, Portugal turned back toward the church, but the Lisbon she inherited was no longer a city of medieval faith. Its people had lived through the impossible. Their worldview could not return to innocence. The quake had left an intellectual scar that neither sermons nor censures could erase. The Enlightenment had entered through the cracks in the earth, and no royal decree could close them. Elsewhere in Europe, The Lisbon earthquake continued to shape minds. It became a benchmark for science, an event so meticulously documented that future geologists would study it for centuries. Pombal's questionnaire, sent to every parish in Portugal after the disaster, was recognized as one of the first systematic scientific surveys in history. From those simple reports, the ground shook north to south, animals fled before dawn, the river rose 3 times, a new science was born: seismology. Lisbon's pain had become humanity's data. But beyond science, the quake also reshaped culture. Painters depicted scenes of crumbling churches and roaring seas. Poets wrote elegies for the dead and meditations on the cruelty of fate. Philosophers debated whether suffering could ever be justified. In this way, the Lisbon earthquake became something greater than an event. It became a mirror, reflecting every human fear about chaos and meaning, even as time smoothed its memory. The physical reminders endured. The ruins of the Carmo convent were left untouched, their roofless arches framing the sky. The government declared them sacred, a monument to memory and mortality. Tourists came to stand beneath those stone ribs and imagine the morning the heavens fell. The sunlight there felt heavier somehow, as if burdened by ghosts. The Baixa, meanwhile, thrived. Markets filled with the scent of oranges and coffee, porters shouted along the docks, and horses clattered down the new, straight avenues. By day, it was difficult to believe this had once been a field of corpses. By night, when fog rolled in from the Tagus, the ghosts returned. The fishermen claimed to see faces in the mist, their mouths open as if still calling for help. Few admitted to believing such tales, but few walked alone by the river after midnight either. The philosophical tremors spread even further. Across the Atlantic, in the American colonies, thinkers like Thomas Jefferson cited the Lisbon earthquake as proof that nature followed laws, not miracles. "The earth moves according to her own design," he wrote, echoing Pombal's practicality more than any priest's sermon. The lesson of Lisbon had crossed oceans. By the end of the century, Europe itself stood on the edge of another kind of quake, the political revolutions that would topple monarchies and reorder societies. In a strange way, Lisbon had been the first shock. It had shown the fragility of empires, the limits of divine right, and the power of human reason to rebuild what the heavens destroyed. And yet, even amid progress, there was nostalgia. The old Lisbon, the city of bells and saints, of incense and processions, lived on in stories and songs. The new city might have been stronger, but it could never again be innocent. The earth had taught its people that salvation was not in the heavens, but in the hands of those who dared to rebuild. As the century turned, the people of Lisbon gathered each November to light candles along the riverfront. Children who had never seen the quake learned to recite the hour it struck. The bells tolled softly at 9:40 a.m., not in fear anymore, but in remembrance. The sound rolled over the city's clean white walls, over the river, and out to the Atlantic, where the waves carried it away back to the depths from which the end of the world had once risen. By the time the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Lisbon had become a paradox, ancient and modern, rational and haunted, proud and quietly wounded. The Marquis of Pombal was long dead, but his shadow still stretched across the city like an invisible grid, as precise and inescapable as the streets he designed. Travellers arriving by sea saw a city reborn in bright stone and symmetry, its waterfront gleaming with yellow facades and colonnades. To the world, Lisbon was a symbol of human triumph over nature, but to those who lived there, the memory of that November morning in 1755 was still written in the cracks of the earth and the silence before each dawn. The rebuilt Baixa had become the centre of commerce and daily life. Shops bustled with trade from Portugal's remaining colonies, their goods displayed in neat rows: coffee from Brazil, sugar from Madeira, ivory from Angola. The sound of haggling replaced the cries of panic that once filled those same streets. Yet, every All Saints' Day the bustle paused, markets closed, ships lowered their flags, and churches filled with people who had inherited their ancestors' fear. Even those too young to remember, children born decades later, spoke of the earthquake as though they had lived it. It was part of Lisbon's identity, woven into the rhythm of its bells. The city itself bore constant reminders. The Carmo convent, still roofless, stood as a skeleton against the sky, a holy wound left open by Pombal's decree. Its broken arches framed the heavens like ribs, grass grew between the stones, and pigeons nested where the altar once stood. Lovers met there in secret, Children dared one another to enter at night, and poets came to write about the day faith collapsed. Lisbon's ruin had become its museum. Meanwhile, the ideas the earthquake had unleashed were still rippling outward. Across Europe, the Enlightenment's optimism had hardened into something more complex. Thinkers no longer asked whether disasters were divine punishment. They asked how to predict them, measure them, and prevent their destruction. The Lisbon quake had birthed not only seismology but an entirely new mindset. The belief that the world was governed by discoverable laws, not mysteries. By the early 1800s, scientists studying earthquakes in Italy and Japan cited Lisbon's 1755 catastrophe as their starting point. The reports Pombal had gathered, hundreds of eyewitness testimonies describing the direction of shaking, the sound before the tremor, the color of the sea, became a foundation for modern geology. Lisbon's tragedy had become Earth's first laboratory. And yet, even as reason flourished, a philosophical wound remained open. The Lisbon earthquake had forced Europe to confront a question that still had no answer. If the universe is ruled by laws, not mercy, then where does meaning come from? That unease haunted the 19th century, as deeply as it had haunted Lisbon's survivors. Voltaire's skepticism became Nietzsche's nihilism, and the city that had burned became a symbol for the fragility of all human certainty. Lisbon itself continued to evolve. The strict geometry of the Pombaline Baixa began to soften with age. Balconies filled with flowers, laundry fluttered from symmetrical windows, and vendors called out from beneath the arches. The rational grid Pombali had imposed began to feel lived in, softened by the warmth of life. Yet, under that calm order lay a quieter revolution. The people of Lisbon had learned, in their bones, that faith and fear were not opposites but companions. They still prayed, but now they also measured. Travellers from England and France marvelled at this mixture of devotion and pragmatism. Lisbon, wrote one visitor in 1815, is a city that believes in God by day and in engineers by night. It was not meant as an insult. It was simply true. The earthquake had created a new kind of citizen, one who looked upward for comfort but downward for safety. But for all its new elegance, Lisbon remained poor compared to the days of empire. The colonies that had once funded its grandeur were slipping away. Gold from Brazil no longer flowed freely. The sugar trade was weakening, and the navy that once ruled the Atlantic now limped along behind British protection. Pombal's rational order could rebuild a city, but it could not resurrect a waning empire. Lisbon, bright and disciplined, had become a survivor rather than a conqueror. Still, the memory of survival gave the city its strange resilience. When storms tore through the harbour, the people simply rebuilt the docks. When cholera struck, they turned the new sewers into their salvation. The same discipline that had saved them in 1755 was now their way of life. To live in Lisbon was to understand impermanence, and to keep building anyway. Visitors often noticed that Lisbon's people smiled differently. They were courteous but distant, as if part of their minds were always listening for something. A faint rumble, a whisper in the stones. Even laughter seemed cautious, like a song sung in defiance of something that could not be named. At night, the city glowed golden under oil lamps. The Tagus shimmered with reflections of the rebuilt Praça do Comércio, its statue casting a long shadow over the water. Sailors returning from voyages to Brazil or Angola would stand on the decks, staring at the city's lights, knowing that beneath that beauty lay centuries of ash. "It is a city that remembers," one captain wrote in his log, and because it remembers, it endures. Beyond Portugal, the Lisbon quake continued to haunt the imagination of Europe's writers and thinkers. Goethe, Schopenhauer, and later Voltaire's disciples would all reference it as proof that human reason was fragile before nature's indifference. In many ways, the earthquake never ended. It simply changed form. It became a metaphor for every moral and intellectual collapse that followed. Revolutions, wars, the crumbling of empires. Lisbon had been the first to fall, and the first to rise again. By the mid-19th century, Lisbon's people had learned to speak of the quake with a strange pride. "We were buried," they would say, "and we rebuilt." The city's children grew up, playing in streets that had once been fault lines, unaware that beneath their feet lay layers of history compressed like stone. The memory of terror had transformed into a quiet confidence, a faith not in divine protection but in human endurance. And yet, on certain mornings when the river was still, and the bells began their slow, heavy tolling, the city seemed to hold its breath. The sound rolled across the hills, echoing through narrow alleys and open squares, reminding everyone, merchant, priest, or fisherman, that the ground beneath them was never truly still. Lisbon had survived the earth, the sea, and even its own doubt. What remained was a lesson the world would never forget, that civilization is not a fortress, but a flame, fragile, flickering, and beautiful precisely because it can be extinguished. By the 1770s, as the new century approached, Lisbon stood reborn, gleaming like a polished mirror, reflecting both triumph and trauma. The city's streets, laid out in perfect grids, shone in the sun like veins of marble. From the hilltops of Alfama and Bairro Alto, you could see the symmetry stretching toward the Tagus River, the deliberate mathematical beauty that had replaced the tangled heart of the old medieval capital. It was a living monument to human reason, a promise carved from root. But beneath that order lay something deeper, memory. The survivors of 1755 were old now. They shuffled through the squares they had once crossed in terror, pointing out where cathedrals had crumbled or fires had raged. The children and grandchildren who followed them listened wide-eyed, half disbelieving that this peaceful, humming city had once been a furnace of stone and flame. It was the day the sky fell, the elders, and though the story had been told so many times it had turned into legend, the tremor in their voices was real. The Carmo convent still stood roofless on the hill, its open arches framing blue sky like a wound that refused to close. Pombal had ordered it to remain that way, and now it had become a kind of shrine, not to faith, but to endurance. At sunset, its broken walls glowed orange, the shadows stretching down toward the rebuilt bays, where merchants and sailors went about their business as if the world had always been this calm. Tourists from across Europe climbed the hill to see it, whispering as they entered, "This is where the earth remembered its strength." In the squares below, Lisbon bustled with new life. Street vendors sold oranges and roasted chestnuts. Carts rattled over the cobblestones. The cries of seagulls mingled with the bells of rebuilt churches. The Praça do Comércio, once a palace courtyard, now a vast civic plaza, was filled with carriages and traders. Its colonnades cast long shadows over the crowd, and the bronze statue of King José I, astride his rearing horse, loomed above them. Few who passed beneath it thought of the man himself anymore, pale, nervous, afraid of walls. But the symbol endured. The king's survival, like Lisbon's, had become part of the myth. The Marquis of Pombal, however, had not lived to see this final calm. His political fall after King José's death in 1777 had left him exiled and bitter, but his city outlasted his disgrace. Even his enemies admitted it. Whatever else he had been, tyrant, reformer, heretic, he had saved Lisbon. His vision still ruled its geometry, its rhythm, its very way of breathing. The streets he had designed were like sentences written in stone, rational, exact, unchanging. But beyond Lisbon, the world was shifting again. Across the Atlantic, colonies were rebelling. In France, whispers of revolution grew. The ideas that the Lisbon earthquake had set in motion, the questioning of divine order, the belief in reason, the distrust of hierarchy, were spreading like cracks across the old world. The tremor that had begun beneath Portugal was still travelling outward, invisible but unstoppable. Even as Europe changed, Lisbon held fast to its strange duality, a city of faith built on doubt, a monument to both science and superstition. Its people prayed, but they also measured. When minor tremors shook the region in 1761, no one spoke of divine punishment anymore. They measured the movement, recorded the time, and rebuilt what little fell. The reflex of panic had become the reflex of progress. Lisbon had learned to listen to the earth not as a voice of judgment, but as a teacher. The Enlightenment had begun as philosophy, but here in Lisbon it had taken physical form. Every stone in the Baixa was an Enlightenment idea rendered solid. Straight lines instead of winding alleys, order over chaos, fire breaks between buildings, rational safety over blind faith, identical facades, equality at least in appearance for all. It was urban philosophy, a manifesto in masonry. And yet, for all its brilliance, the city could not entirely escape melancholy. Lisboners had inherited a peculiar kind of silence, a pause between laughter and thought, a flicker of hesitation before joy. They lived as if remembering that the ground itself might betray them. At weddings, old people still watched the floor nervously when the music grew loud. When thunder rolled across the Atlantic, mothers drew their children closer. No one had forgotten that the sea could turn traitor too. Still, life returned fully. By the end of the century, Lisbon's streets bustled with sailors and scholars, priests and scientists, the old and the new walking side by side. Candlelight glowed from the windows of taverns, built over ancient foundations. Music drifted from open doors, and in the narrow alleys above the Baixa, young lovers leaned on railings and watched the river shimmer, unaware that the world beneath their feet had once cracked open like glass. The city had changed not just in structure but in spirit. The earthquake had stripped Lisbon of its illusions, of sanctity, of safety, of certainty, and what remained was something far more human: humility. Lisbon no longer imagined itself untouchable. It had seen its own mortality and chosen to build anyway. The philosopher Kant once said that the Lisbon earthquake was proof that man must learn from nature, not beg mercy from it. Perhaps in its quiet way the city had taken that lesson to heart. Travellers who came to Lisbon after the fire and fury found a city unlike any other. To some, it seemed too clean, too measured, too mathematical. To others, it was a miracle of rebirth. One British visitor wrote, "Lisbon does not live in the present, it lives in the echo of what it survived." That was true. Every sunrise over the Tagus, every bell that rang through the air, every step along those straight streets was a kind of defiance, a way of saying to the earth itself, "You may shake us again, but we will not vanish." The ruins of Carmo still stood in silence above it all, as if guarding the memory. When the wind moved through the open arches, it made a sound like faint whispering, like the city speaking to itself. To stand there was to feel the weight of time, the fragility of everything built by human hands, and the strange, stubborn beauty of trying again anyway. Lisbon had been destroyed by the wrath of the earth, and rebuilt by the force of will. What began as tragedy had become testimony. The stones of its streets no longer trembled. They breathed, and those centuries would pass, and new storms would come. The lesson would endure, etched not in marble, but in the human spirit that refused to crumble. As the years turned to centuries, Lisbon's rebirth settled into legend. The catastrophe of 1755 became a story that grandparents told by candlelight, the details blurred by time, but the awe unchanged. The ground opened, they would say, and the sea swallowed the city. Children would shiver and glance toward the Tagus, half expecting to see the water rise again. The story no longer belonged to the living. It had passed into myth, and yet the city itself, its stones, its streets, its scars, remained the clearest proof that the tale was true. By the dawn of the 19th century, Lisbon had grown peaceful, even picturesque. Visitors arriving by ship saw a city gleaming in the sun, its facades painted in soft yellows and whites, its waterfront neat as a stage set. From a distance, no one could have guessed that this order had been born from chaos. But for those who lived there, memory was everywhere. Beneath every arch and stairway lay the bones of the old city, the medieval alleys, the collapsed convents, the ash of thousands who had perished. Lisbon's beauty was not denial, it was remembrance made elegant. The Carmo convent remained untouched, its skeletal frame rising like an open prayer. Ivy crept up its broken walls, and sunlight streamed through the absent roof where angels had once been painted. Beneath its stones, silence lived. Travellers wrote that standing there felt like standing inside time itself. Here, one visitor wrote in 1830, "You hear what the earth remembers." The government had preserved it as a ruin on purpose, part warning, part monument. Lisbon, unlike so many cities that sought to forget their tragedies, had chosen to keep its wound visible. The people, too, had inherited the quake's quiet wisdom. They moved through life with a strange steadiness, a kind of calm born from having already survived the end of the world once. When tremors struck elsewhere in Europe, Lisbon's residents would simply look at one another and nod, as if to say, "We know." Their city had taught them that fear could be lived with, that uncertainty was not death. They did not trust the ground, but they trusted themselves. Philosophers still wrote about Lisbon's fall, as if it were an allegory. To some, it symbolized divine wrath, to others human frailty, to still others enlightenment. But for Lisbon's own people, it was something simpler, a reminder that everything, no matter how grand, was temporary. Churches could burn, empires could collapse, but cachet quiet, stubborn courage could outlast them all. The rationalist spirit Pombal had planted continued to shape the city long after his death. Lisbon's engineers and architects carried on his obsession with safety and planning. New bridges and docks were built with the same mathematical precision as the old Baixa. The Pombaline cage, once an experimental curiosity, became the standard for construction throughout Portugal. Even as Europe rushed into the age of steam and steel, Lisbon still measured itself against the tremors of 1755. Every blueprint, every beam, carried the question, what if it happens again? It never did, at least not on that scale. Smaller earthquakes rattled Portugal over the centuries, but none matched the ferocity of that November morning. Lisbon endured each one calmly, almost serenely, as if the city itself had learned to breathe with the earth. The fear never disappeared entirely, but it softened into respect, a quiet understanding between human and nature. The earthquake's true legacy, though, was not in stone or science, but in thought. The Lisbon disaster had transformed how Europe saw the universe. It had forced philosophers to abandon the idea that suffering was divinely just, that tragedy carried moral purpose. It had inspired scientists to seek natural explanations, architects to design for survival, and governments to prepare for catastrophe. In its own terrible way, Lisbon's destruction had accelerated civilization. Out of fire came foresight, out of ruin, reason. Still, the city never lost its soul. Its faith had changed, but not vanished. It had simply grown quieter, more personal. The people still filled the churches each All Saints' Day, lighting candles at 9:40 a.m., the moment the quake had begun, but their prayers were softer now, more like conversations than pleadings. They no longer asked God to keep the earth still. They thanked him for giving them the strength to stand when it moved. By the late 1800s, Lisbon was once again a hub of art, literature, and trade. Poets walked its hills, painters captured the glow of its light. But even as it thrived, the earthquake remained the invisible foundation of everything. Its presence could be felt in the city's architecture, in its education system, in the resilience of its people. To live in Lisbon was to live with memory as a neighbor. And then came the 20th century, new wars, new technologies, new upheavals. Yet, even as bombs fell elsewhere, as regimes rose and fell, Lisbon endured. The earth stayed still, as if it too remembered what it had done once and had no need to repeat it. When the modern world arrived with cars on its cobblestones and electric light in its plazas, the city's soul remained unchanged. The same sea breezes carried the same scent of salt and citrus, and the same bells rang each November morning, a low, solemn hum across the rooftops. Now, centuries later, if you walk through Lisbon at dawn, you can still feel it, that quiet tension between beauty and memory. The air is soft, the light golden, the streets still aligned with Pombel's perfect geometry. But beneath your feet, deep in the crust of the earth, the fault lines sleep, and in that silence lies the city's truest miracle. Not that it survived, but that it learned how to live again. You imagine yourself standing in the Praça do Comércio, the tagus shining silver before you. Around you, the city hums awake, the trams rattle, the seagulls cry, the bells begin their slow toll. Somewhere, high above, the ruins of Carmo catch the first rays of sunlight. The same light that once revealed the ashes of a dying world, now gilds a living one. You breathe in the salt, the stone, the faint scent of oranges. The air is warm. The ground beneath you is steady. Good night. Sweet dreams.